is Yasmine and I'm Senior Policy Officer within the Chief Execs. I've been the key lead officer in the Council to take forward the development of the pilot project in terms of developing an integrated approach to equality and human rights impact assessments. In terms of Renfrewshire Council's approach, what we have done is we've looked at, first of all, we piloted the integrated approach, taking the future proposals in terms of the advice services. We then looked at what kind of training was required, because the key officers that were involved, although they may have an element of expertise in information advice, it doesn't necessarily mean that they had expertise and could look through the lens of the equality and human rights when it comes to assessing the impact. So we provided training for them. It was the external consultant who came in and delivered the training. But internally we already have what's called an iLearn for the public sector equality duty, which is quite comprehensive, and it runs at two different levels. One is just for officers and one is for managers to go on and basically learn about the whole equality duty and what it requires. So to complement that, we had the external consultant Donald McCaskill come in and deliver the human rights aspect of the training to bring everybody up to speed. What I would say at this point also is that we should never assume when we're looking at undertaking an impact assessment that everybody that would be involved in the assessment would have equality and human rights awareness and they have the expertise, or they can look through the equality and human rights lens when they're looking at assessment, because we're quite familiar with looking at vulnerable and marginalised, but we don't connect that through the lens of equality and human rights. The reason that they have to have that knowledge is so they can apply that knowledge to the assessment itself. So we might have an understanding about information and advice delivery services, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we have or the officers involved would always have the knowledge and understanding of applying equality and human rights, either within practice evaluation or assessing impact across the different vulnerable, marginalised or the protected characteristics as they're known. I should also say that to build that knowledge, what Renfrewshire has done as part of this pilot project, one of the spin-offs has been that we've actually developed an e-learning module. Well, to undertake an impact assessment, it is a systematic approach. So to remain focused, you need to provide some sort of guidance. Otherwise, it could become very ad hoc. It could become, well, I suppose everybody could be doing different things. So it's to provide a very standard approach, a systematic approach. So you do need to go through a process of scaling, scoping, gathering the evidence. You need to be able to make sure that you're going to be consulting, because that can very often be missed out in terms of consulting with the right communities and who's going to be likely impacted. Sometimes when we're using the data, again, that could be very old. If you look at the census data, it's every 10 years. So if you're looking at, for example, children and the impact on children, or if you're looking at young people, 10 years on, some children will be either 10 or they'll have reached the age of 20. That's a very big gap. So you do need to provide guidance so that the assessment itself remains very focused throughout the whole process. And no, none of the stages are missed out, because if there's a danger of missing that stage, then the impact assessment could really be, if we come back to the legal requirements, may not then comply with those requirements either, but may also miss out in terms of looking at, sometimes often there's a cumulative impact as well, and we may even miss that function altogether. Reflecting on our approach as part of the pilot project, what I would say is that you definitely need to look at the timing of it all. You can't just assume that because you've gone to a board and you've had something agreed, then you start an impact assessment. That's not possible. So you need to look at the moment you start to think about any kind of proposal or policy that's to be developed. You should be thinking about an impact assessment then. You definitely need to think about the right people, who's going to be involved, and it's not just people who or officers who have the remit for equality and human rights. Yes, they'll bring their own expertise from the lens of equality and human rights, but they won't have all the expertise in terms of that specific policy or procedure. So you need to have the expertise around the table. It definitely cannot be done in isolation. There is no point, and I would stress the point that officers who have the culture and human rights remit cannot sit and do an impact assessment on their own, and that has to be stressed. We brought together a team of 14 people. Yes, that may be, for some that probably sounds, gosh, that was resource incentive, but this was a pilot project and we wanted to assess how we would go forward. So I'm not saying that you would require 14 people every time you're carrying out an assessment, because that depends on the scale and scope of the policy and the procedure. But having said all of that, it certainly isn't a case of like, oh, we've just remembered we need to do an impact assessment, let's give it to the quality or human rights officer. So they would be the thing. The other thing I would say is that you definitely need to have robust evidence which comes in the form of data. You definitely need to close that data gap by going out to consultation, because data isn't always up to date. So you can go out for consultation with the relevant organizations. We sent an invite to over 36 service providers and also those who have an interest in promoting equality and human rights. Okay, we didn't have 36 people we consulted with or organizations, but we did have 15 that came around the table. And that was really, really good because we heard something different from what the data was telling us. Data is only going to be as good as what somebody else is being interpreting that data for anyway. So you do need to look at that. Also, it helps you to build relations with members of the community out there who are going to be impacted, because they feel valued. They feel that, well, okay, we're being consulted, so the council or any organization is serious about what this is going to mean in terms of an impact on the communities or the individuals. I would definitely say that you have to stay focused. You have to make sure that your team is definitely trained up. They have an understanding, not just about their specific areas of interest, but also in equality and human rights, and understand what it means to interpret their own kind of findings against either the general equality duty and the human rights, and what articles apply, because not all articles are going to apply either. So you do have to screen out the ones that are not relevant and just focus on those. Otherwise you can make the job into a bigger job, and that's where it becomes quite overwhelming. It's like, oh, I don't know what to do. So yes, narrow it down to what's really relevant and what's actually going to add value to what you're actually doing.